offered that. Oh man, you missed my intro. No, this keynote presentation is 1 hour long, and then the Zoom room becomes 8 papers over 4 hours on automated and electric vehicle topics, as well as advanced modeling. We've got 4 parallel sessions. So we've got 3 other Zoom rooms that will open up in an hour, and they're on public policy and transport, safety, COVID-19. And then 4 hours from now, so a little staggered from us, is a special session on transit from a new book on transit research. And so that's going to go on. So you could participate for, 8 hours today if you wanted to in this hemisphere. But of course, we've also got the Eastern Hemisphere starting approximately 12 hours after us. So I was listening in last night. It was great. I took my dog on a walk and I actually did aerobics. So this is the nice thing about these conferences. You can eat dinner, you can get things done while you're still participating and learning from people around the world. In this case, we've got an amazing keynote speaker, Hani Mahmassani. He was born in Lebanon, but he did come to the US in 1976 to study civil engineering at the University of Houston, which is in Texas, of course. And he has relatives there. And this was 1 year into Lebanon's 10-year civil war. So this was a safe place to get an education, and we were so lucky he did that. He then went on to Purdue and MIT for his graduate studies. And UT was so fortunate, UT Austin was so fortunate to have him join us as a professor for 20 years. So I was here with him for several of those. He was and remains my main mentor in transportation, and I'm incredibly fortunate to know him. He's also taught at the University of Maryland, and he now directs Northwestern University's Transportation Center, teaching primarily out of civil and environmental engineering department, but also having courtesy appointments in decision sciences, which is in the business school, as well as industrial engineering. He's a past editor of Transportation Science, which is the most rigorous, I feel, of the transportation journals mathematically. And he was the founding editor of Transportation Research Part C, which is on new technologies. So that's pretty fantastic. I was noticing that over 240 of his publications have been cited at least 10 times. That's just incredible. He and the Dean of Faculty, Wanming Jia, who's at Southwest Jiaotong in Chengdu, China, who's a high-speed rail expert. These 2 guys are our discipline's newest inductees into the illustrious National Academy of Engineering, which is our discipline's highest honor. I mean, good luck getting a Nobel Prize. I think getting into the National Academy of Engineering, you do not have to be from the US for that. But in October, they hope to be formally inducted. And so we're really delighted he's here to speak to us today. And I'll get off the screen here and we will hand the podium over to him.
Thank you very much, Cara. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It's an honor and pleasure to be speaking today at this conference, which is was really far-sighted because that was started as an all virtual conference long before COVID. So this is one of the few events that we're doing virtually that was designed as such, as opposed to one that we have been forced to do virtually, which gives it, in my mind, a different flavor because of that. So congratulations on what seems to be another very successful conference. I know last year was the first time I actually participated in it, and I thought at the last year it was particularly important for us to get together, and that was probably one of the very first conferences that was bringing us together after several months of just not really communicating other than with our closest colleagues. Let me go ahead and put this in full share mode. Okay. All right, so today I'm actually going to give a different kind of talk than what most of you are used to hearing me talk about, right? We're not going to have optimization formulations. We're not going to be running cars on networks. We're not going to be doing dynamic assignment or vehicle operations. We're actually just going to talk about what we're about to experience, I guess, with what we're calling the next normal. normal, not the new normal, because we're already in the new normal, but in the next normal, which is what we're looking for in fall, spring, etc. over the next 3 years. What's going to happen to our cities? What's going to happen to our transportation systems? What's going to happen to our work environment? How we shop? How we do various activities? And obviously, because of that, it's going to be much more speculative in terms of where we're going with it. And I'm actually going to ask you to kind of indulge me, because there will be unsupported statements that are made, and again, not the usual way that I give my talks, but I'm hoping to kind of start a conversation, and for those who may not have been thinking about all these issues, to try and kind of put things together to figure out where we might go from here. So of course, the COVID pandemic and all the various measures that were, related with its mitigation can be viewed as the broadest, deepest, longest natural experiment in the use of information and communication technologies for teleactivities, e-processes, etc. That's pretty well established at this point. That this was a sort of a unique natural experiment. So from telework to e-learning, telemedicine to e-shopping, near complete reliance on e-commerce for home delivery, activity and mobility patterns really were appended and transformed dramatically. The key issue is, what can we learn from that? And as the recoveries are in various stages in different parts of the world, we ask how much of this e-engagement is going to remain, how much of it is going to substitute for physical activities versus how much of it is actually going to be stimulating more activities, because we all know from all the work that has been going on over the past 20 plus years with people like Professor Pat Mokhtarian and others, certainly looking at telework and various e-activities, we know that it's not all been substitution, but a lot of the time we've had synergies. We've had complementarity, that is, the virtual is driving the physical and vice versa. So that more communication tends to generate in the over the long run more travel. And so how is this new experience going to shake out? And how much of what we're experiencing is in fact going to last? And ultimately, what kind of normal might lie ahead, so that our planners can plan, so that transit agencies, which are now operating anywhere from 20% to 60% of capacity, depending on whether you're dealing with rail or you're dealing with bus transit in most cities of the world, how they should be positioning their assets, how they should be thinking about mobility in this sort of whatever new or next normal that might lie ahead. And so that's part of the motivation of my talk, and it's also part of the motivation of a tier 1 DOT, US DOT Tier 1 University Transportation Center, which is the center on telemobility, which has three main questions. How much of these, again, ICT-related activities, these teleactivities that we're experiencing or have experienced as part of this lockdown and everything that has gone with it, are likely to remain once restrictions are progressively lifted? How is then the supply side changing, and how is it likely to evolve from there? So by supply side, we have both the supply side of e-activities, the providers of these platforms, etc., and the supply side of transportation, that is our our transit systems, etc. And what might be a desirable level of dependence, if you wish, or substitution of teleactivities and e-services, because for many years we've been, as planners, we've been saying, if we can get only 10 to 15% of people to leave earlier, to leave later, to change their schedules, to work from home 1 or 2 days a week, that might have a serious impact on traffic congestion. What we're seeing today is that with a large fraction still teleworking, Traffic congestion has pretty much come back to most of our large metropolitan areas, so it is not evident that this substitution effect is really leading to kind of the traffic or transportation system impacts that we consider desirable. So part of what we're looking at is what might be a desirable sort of lasting level that might come out of this. And all these questions are still up in the air. Our UTC is a collaboration between Northwestern's Transportation Center, UC Berkeley, and University of Texas, primarily the business school at the University of Texas, because one of the key focus areas we've had is e-commerce, and e-commerce has a significant, again, supply side component that is the suppliers of omni-channel services, et cetera, that is retailers. Okay. And so a lot of what I'm presenting today is coming out of some of the work that is ongoing in the center. So I'm going to be drawing liberally from my colleagues, and I'm going to give them credit in a second. But it's also very much work in progress. And so we do not have definitive results. I don't know that anybody has definitive results, but we're going to try to see what we've learned so far. So here is a kind of our high level framework for examining transportation and travel demand impacts of e-activities. Okay, and you could see that at the center here of this framework are individual and household demand choices that people make, choices that they make about adopting and participating in e-activities, and then alongside that, the virtual physical activity engagement and travel behavior that they engage in, because that is what's, again, producing the travel impacts and the impacts on the transportation system. Okay, so what is different in this framework than what we typically have in our transportation models is this e-activity supply side. Okay, these are the decisions that firms are making or agencies might be making in each one of these domains. So one of them is e-commerce, and then what Amazon does in e-commerce, what Walmart does in e-commerce is going to be very critical to the kind of e-activities and e-shopping behavior that individuals can engage in. With telework, it's the choices that the companies, the employers are making about reconfiguring really the work activities of the company to enable telework to continue in a productive way. And when it comes to e-learning, it's again the decisions that the suppliers of education, schools, universities, etc., might be doing in that regard, and their technology providers. Then you have areas like telemedicine, which really, as transportation people, we never quite worried about, but we have run a webinar on telemedicine, and we've learned a lot of fascinating things about that whole industry, how it is changing with the new technologies, under the influence as well of insurance companies trying to cut costs. So there are many different things that come together in these choices. And then we added esports and gaming, because we've always thought that, well, when it comes to entertainment, that is something you have to do physically, other than, say, streaming services and so on. But that is also changing with again, creative suppliers that are providing some of these capabilities. And so to understand how this may be evolving, we have put a lot of focus on what firms are doing in these domains. Of course, we're not going to be expert in all of these different areas, and we're focusing on e-commerce and telework, with then trying to learn as much as we can about these other areas. And so when it comes then to what households and individuals are doing, of course, the transportation supply side, as we always have in our models, will influence these choices, but now there is that much more influence, if you wish, from the E side, from the e-activity side. And in our framework, then, these travel impacts will influence these policy interventions. Policy interventions meant to influence what the firms are doing, as well as, of course, the interventions on the transportation side. And again, all of this is interrelated. So we've focused a lot of our effort on in the middle, if you wish, in terms of understanding the behavioral aspects of these processes, but also understanding the supply side on the business side, if you wish, what firms are doing. And we already have the tools to put the outcomes of all of these things to evaluate the impacts on our transportation system. And so there, it's a matter of defining the appropriate scenarios that we can use to evaluate that. So other considerations in looking at this problem, it's really, you can't do demand without doing supply. Predicting demand must necessarily entail understanding the supply side and the forces that are governing the evolution of these business processes that determine the options available to customers. So you can do a survey of workers and tell them, do you like to telework? Will you continue to telework? And 60% will tell you, oh yeah, I'd love to do that. But if employers are not on board, then that is not going to translate into a specific impact that in terms of the transportation sector. The other element here is there really is a symbiotic interplay between virtual and physical worlds. Adoption, engagement, and use of these teleactivity channels and e-processes cannot be analyzed and projected in a meaningful way independently of with the corresponding sort of real physical world activities. When you shop, eventually that package has to be delivered. There is a physical element to a lot of these activities, and you can do this conference and it may not have a physical element other than in a sort of in a micro way, but ultimately these connections that we develop virtually, unless we are able to then meet physically, will probably fizzle away and not lead to, say, collaboration and so on. The other thing is the process is highly dynamic. Things have been, as we all know, have been changing fairly rapidly in the e-domain. They have been changing rapidly in terms of technology and so on. And we've been dealing with shocks, with disruptions and policy interventions. And so it has just been, for us who like to model dynamics, one that certainly is highly dynamic, with also a lot of stochasticity thrown in for good measure. Okay. Some amazing facts that we learned through this pandemic. One, the world continued to function, more or less. I mean, who would have thought that you could just, from one day to another, conduct all of your activities virtually? And that pretty much happened, and the world continued to function. Economies continued to reasonably do okay. Some sectors of the economy did extremely well. Others, went poorly. But the world continued to function even as everybody hunkered down in their homes, and companies closed their offices, etc. The internet did not crash. Much of the human activity that did not involve physical presence continued virtually, and that really is not a small feat, considering all the hassles one has occasion, with connecting, with Wi-Fi, etc. But by and large, that communication infrastructure has really served us remarkably well. The other fact that we learned is that connectivity and e-activity are now firmly a major source of resilience for economic activity and many life-sustaining essentials. It used to be if you had a disruption, flood or something, or whether man-made or natural, things ground to a halt and nothing continued to move. And now we have learned that ultimately there is considerable resilience because of connectivity, because of the ability to conduct activities virtually. And so if and when we have future physical disruptions, the world can continue to function, and we now have contingency plans in place that have just been developed because they had to. But it is quite remarkable, in fact, that so much continued with purely a virtual sort of platform. But there are downsides. Okay, we're are ever more vulnerable to cyber attacks, to the functioning of the telecom infrastructure and power grid failures. We're ever more dependent on the physical movement of goods and the functioning of global supply chains with vulnerable sources. And we've also learned, and there is probably still some disagreement about that, that e-activities are not sustainable as the exclusive delivery channel in the long run, while maintaining quality, productivity, and innovation. And that's going to be very sector specific, but I'm in the education sector, and I can tell you that I cannot continue teaching our students exclusively virtually because we're not providing the same quality of learning. I know because I switched back to in-person as early as we were allowed, and it made a big difference in terms of the quality of what I thought we were teaching our students. And many companies have come to similar conclusions about productivity and innovation, notwithstanding the fact that there are instances where the ability to work remotely can certainly improve productivity, but by and large, sustaining e-activities as the exclusive delivery channel is probably not a sustainable way of operating. And we need to go to the doctor, kids need to be in school, etc. And so while we have resilience from these, where we've also learned a lot of these downsides here. Okay, so all right, so let's kind of look at some numbers when we talk about resilience and the magnitude of what we've been dealing with. I've put together some numbers here. This is Zoom by the numbers. Compared with the same quarter of the previous year, Zoom meeting minutes are 3.3 trillion minutes, 3.3 trillion minutes, and you could see the increase compared to even just February 2019 or the third quarter of 2020, you could see this huge jump in Zoom annual minutes. If you look at the Zoom annual webinar minutes, that's 45 billion minutes. Again, you could see the huge jump that we've seen there. And just looking at the number of daily meeting participants from December 31, 2019, pre-COVID, where we're 10 million. In April 2020, we were up to 300 million. And of course, this is more than a year ago. So we're way higher if you look at it more recently. Okay. If you look at e-commerce, it's generally believed that COVID-19 introduced an acceleration in the online share of total retail sales. And if you look at the lower left graph here, this is the quarterly share of e-commerce sales of total US retail sales from, in this case, I'm looking at from the first quarter in 2017 to the first quarter of 2021, and that big jump that you see in share from about 11% to nearly 18% here is the sort of initial COVID bump. But as you could see, we've sort of kind of given back a lot of that, and we seem to be stabilizing at a level that is beginning to approach where we might have been had this previous trend continued. So there was an acceleration and then a drop back, and this has been noticed in a lot of the numbers that have been made available. On the top right graph, you could see the total retail sales for non-store retailers, which we interpret as being the virtual or online retailers. And again, you could see the big jump that we had right about March, and that was sustained and has continued since. But again, but the growth rate has pretty much considerably decelerated and is much more comparable to what we had pre-COVID after that initial initial bump. And if you ask people in general, has coronavirus impacted your shopping behavior, you will see that again, somewhere in the 85 to 90 something percent are saying yes, of course it has. We're doing much more online. And if you look at the supply side here, you look at the annual sales of Amazon in the US, well, actually in several markets, US, Germany, UK, Japan, and rest of world. Again, you could see that huge acceleration that was observed in 2020, and that has continued there. So if you have owned, of course, Amazon stock, you're right up there with Jeff Bezos, doing great. All right. So with all of this, what is happening to actual physical actual physical store attendance? Well, using geolocation data or geolocation fencing of trajectory data, essentially cell phone tracking, etc. INRIX and others have tried to essentially capture monthly mall visits. So this is all relative to January 2020 baseline, okay? And so that's the 0 point. And so for the overall US, there was a drop because of COVID of 91%. At one point, all stores were closed and the drop was huge. This was almost a complete collapse. There was a recovery, and today, actually, we're 5% over that baseline level. So people have really wanted to go out and go to the mall and shop. And this is data from Austin. It's a little over the national average of 8%. And Chicago is actually highest in the nation, and we're at 18% over that baseline. So quite a bit of latent demand here that we're observing in Chicago, and most other places tend to be in that general range. Some are still slightly below. I think New York City, for example, may be slightly below. But then if you look at hardware store visits, and now hardware stores are a little different because they're considered essential. Essential retailers. So they did not really have the big drop. They continued to increase dramatically during COVID. So when you could not go to Macy's, you could go to Home Depot, and they had the big acceleration here, which then, as the other stores opened, sort of decreased. Pretty much what we saw with online sales generally, that some decrease, but then now it's back up to those levels. And so again, still a big jump for these stores. All right. So what this is telling us then is that, so while online has grown considerably and has continued to grow, so has physical when people were, when those restrictions were removed. So this appears to me to be another example of complementarity here, not substitution. Yes, it was substitution when under constrained conditions, but when those constraints were removed, what we saw is both are taking place at a high rate. And so the trend towards digitalization of freight and the shift from brick and mortar to online, was well underway pre-COVID, but now what we're seeing is a continuation of what was previously recognized, which is a symbiotic and evolving relationship between in-store and online, with digital driving traffic to the store. So pre-COVID, 80% of sales were in stores, but 60% of total retail sales were actually digitally influenced. And COVID-19 served as an accelerator. And what we're seeing now is that, while online buying will retain many of sort of the lockdown gains that had, these shifts are neither exclusionary nor substitutive, and people are going back to malls with pleasure, but increasingly armed with online item searches. So again, this is an example where the virtual and the physical have been coming together strongly. So don't write physical shopping off yet. Again, all indications are that people are going back even, with considerable appetite, if you wish. Now, if you look at travel overall, you look at travels per day. This is from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, pretty much in terms of number of trips. We have seen a recovery to pre-pandemic levels, but of course the purposes are different, and they're different in terms of characteristics, in terms of length. And so if you, this is also from BTS on the right-hand side, you look at trips that are shorter than 1 mile, those have sort of recovered. They're above even 2019 levels. Between 25 and 100 miles, they're closer to the 2019 levels, but still a little bit below that. But what's really interesting is if you look at the longer trips, longer than 100 miles, even in 2020, when some of the restrictions were removed, people were making more of these longer trips than they were pre-pandemic. And what we're seeing in 2021 is pretty much a sort of a continuation of these higher level. And that's because when people were constrained and were not able to go to the sort of usual places, as soon as they had an opportunity, they took longer distance trips. And I recall having a discussion on that and a prediction of that, in fact, on no more scientific place than Facebook. And we had that big, I was attacked for predicting that this would be happening, that people will actually be driving longer distances for their trip making. And I think the evidence is bearing that out. If you look at passenger car vehicle miles traveled, again, after the initial drop that we saw pretty much everywhere in the world, numbers are back up to pre-COVID levels. Have figures here from both the US and from France, and clearly this is not a US phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon that we've been observing. And so this brings us to telework. If these people are not traveling to go to work, because what are these trips for? And so essentially travel is continuing for other purposes. But if we look at the work trip side, this is data again from BTS. Essentially, both of these graphs have the same information, except the one on the left has the initial base of people who had said they were teleworking. And again, we can get into definitions here. Professor Mokhtarian generally will explain all the the fine details of what is work from home, etc. This is now for the same set of questions that BTS is asking, pre and then in 2021. And so the last week that I'm looking at here is in March 2021. And so the one on the right-hand side doesn't have the initial level pre-COVID, but it has, it's sorted nicely in in increasing order. And so when you look at Mississippi, for example, they're now teleworking at a rate of 20%, but you look at Washington, DC, and that's the anomaly, that there it's over 60% that are teleworking. And of course, the explanation there is the federal government. Perhaps that's why people say that the view from DC is different than the rest of the country. But clearly we can see that it's a much higher level of teleworking. I guess one can say about how essential that, if how essential is physical presence for government employees, probably not that essential. So the ability to work remotely is much higher than the rest of the country. But you look at the US average, and we're right under 40% at this point. And usually if you want to know what the US average is, look at Illinois. Illinois is always very close to this, to the center, to the middle, and it's right, again, you can see here, it's maybe 1 or 2 percentage points higher than the national average. You have places like New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland, which again, with and Virginia, where you have a lot of government workers, where these percentages are close to 50%, but in many other states, they're closer to 30, 35%. And so that's the magnitude of telework that we have. And that could be interpreted as it being the magnitude of activities that could be done remotely, though perhaps not permanently, because we have seen that fraction reduce somewhat. Okay, so but that's useful information to have as we are constructing future scenarios. All right, so but one thing that's interesting is if you look at the fraction of telecommuters, you could see how it so clearly increases with income level. So is telework really a high income privilege in a way? And there is some fact to that, because you are most able to determine where you want to work from when you can, when you have unique skills. And so if you have unique technical skills, for example, unique IP, then you could be, more spatially distributed. This has been going on for a long time in higher end tech situations or in certain financial consulting, etc. areas. And if you control capital, then you can also kind of call the shot and decide that. And those individuals are typically going to have higher incomes, and whereas the lower income ranges, you're going to be dealing with more essential workers, etc., where the job is not readily telecommutable. But that is a striking trend that I had not sort of noticed previously. And so I'm going to go next into some of the kind of original work that we've been doing here, new data, and I'd like to give credit to all our sort of co-workers or our faculty participants in our UTC, and also some of the key PhD students with related to the work that I'm presenting today, but particularly acknowledge the work, the collaboration with Amanda Statopoulos, Susan Shaheen, and John Walker at Berkeley, as well as Sunil Chopra and Yana Statopoulos, who have been again instrumental on the sort of e-commerce supply side. And so again, I'm drawing from this collective contribution of folks. And so if we elaborate the framework for analyzing telemobility, right, we have the context in terms of land use, policies, the mobility system, socioeconomic characteristics, leading to the adoption of teleoptions with the influence of COVID-19 as a key factor here, both supply adoption strategies on the firm side as well as individual adoption. Then this experience here is determining in part what will happen next, both by employers and employees and various suppliers. And then we can look at the income, at the outcomes, if you wish, the impacts in the short term and the long term. And so again, within that framework, we sought to get data. So we conducted a tracking survey with 6 different waves administered every 2 weeks, and those were administered in the period from December to about March or April 2021. So it was kind of past the initial big waves where things were beginning to sort of restabilize with a lot of online activity, but then the ability to go to stores, etc. And we asked every 2 weeks, we asked people about expenditures, we asked them about deliveries, we asked them about discretionary travel, about where they've been working, and sort of their sentiment in terms of risk that they may be perceiving about COVID-19. Of course, we got social demographics. We also asked them about the pre-COVID baseline. Of course, that's recall, but that's the only way we could do it, given that we were not surveying them pre-COVID. And we asked a whole bunch of questions on attitudes and perceptions, tech savviness, environmental friendliness, how they perceive work from home, etc. And we also asked questions about monthly expenditures, travel modes, direct COVID-19 impacts, whether they lost their job, whether they're testing, quarantining, vaccination, and how they're kind of change, how their time use is changing. So a whole variety of questions trying to deal with these issues. And we're still deeply analyzing a lot of that information. We're not even close to being finished with that, but I have some interesting initial results results that I would like to share with you. And we've also asked them, and particularly in wave 5 here, about some of their experiences during the pandemic, particularly in terms of work from home. And it's from that one that I'm going to show you some results on telework satisfaction. Okay. So a very rich source of information, and this is kind of how the waves occurred. We started out with the initial number, and then we had refreshers subject to certain social demographic characteristics, so that we can maintain national representativeness of our admittedly small sample ultimately, but that still is a fairly thoughtfully conducted design. And again, Amanda Statopoulos gets most of the credit for that, along with Divya Kant Talian and Maher Saeed, our two PhD students. And so first question here, based on this data, is for whom did telework not work during the pandemic? And so we're looking at trying to understand the factors that impact telework satisfaction using, in this case, a multiple indicator, multiple cause, or mimic model. Okay, and so if we ask, these are the responses, very simple responses. It goes from dissatisfied to neither dissatisfied nor satisfied, and then somewhat satisfied and very satisfied. And what we found is about only 74% of our individuals reported being somewhat or very satisfied with telework in terms of this response. And so we tried to understand what are the factors underlying that. And we did it. I mean, the model we built is a fairly elaborate one where we sort of the base model here is an ordered probit model where we try to understand sort of systematic heterogeneity in telework satisfaction, and it's augmented with the generalized structural equation model with categorical endogenous data, where essentially tries to give a causal structure to our understanding of satisfaction. So telework satisfaction is envisioned as a function of experience or perceived telework barriers, benefits and barriers. So you have benefits, that's one equation. You have the barriers, it's another equation, and that's including both social demographics, but also questions that we have regarding their perceptions of the benefits, their perception of barriers, that again, a whole series of questions that were asked. And from that, then we come up with the telework satisfaction index, if you want to call it that, or propensity. And with the ordinal model structure, then if that propensity is less than a certain threshold, then you're not satisfied. Then you have another threshold, and you're going to be neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. Then and so on. So it's a classic sort of ordered probit model in that sense. So I'll show you initial results. And in this case, this is just the ordered probit model without the whole structural equation. And one of the hypotheses we had actually is the effect of age. And sure enough, if you look at that model, you find that age is highly significant, but we also have a age squared term. And what that means essentially is that the propensity here to be satisfied has this parabolic shape, where if you are younger and you're older, your satisfaction level is actually much less than if you are in that sort of middling group here in terms of age. So millennials tend to be more satisfied than sort of the current younger folks, but then boomers and Gen Xers are not that happy with the whole telework situation. And there's various reasons to that. One is that if you are older, you have two sort of reasons there. One is that there may be technology issues, but really you have an identification with the workplace. It's part of where you socialize and so on, and you're kind of missing that. And similarly for the younger folks, they kind of are missing that interaction. They're not getting the right onboarding. Again, a lot of their socialization tends to be also around coworkers and so on. So at both ends, we have that sort of less satisfaction than we tend to have in the middle. And those who have less than an undergraduate education seem to be more satisfied. Hispanic ethnicity seems to indicate more satisfaction, and concern about related to contracting COVID. Of course, if you're more worried, you're going to be more satisfied working from home. Those that negatively associate with telework satisfaction are the presence of at least one child that may be attending online school from home. And that, again, we've all heard about these issues with managing children's education and trying to work from home. And that's one reason for dissatisfaction. It's perhaps more a dissatisfaction with the kids not being in school than it is worth working from home. The two together is the issue. Now, when we went to the more elaborate structure, the mimic model structure, some of the key results here. So again, the latent variables are the experienced or perceived telework benefits and the experienced or perceived barriers to telework. Each one of these, has its own equation. And so what we found is that, of course, benefits increase satisfaction, barriers reduce satisfaction. And what's interesting is the age variable now went into the part of the structural model and has an indirect impact on satisfaction, but it's still nonlinear in the same way. And so if you look at age in terms of the perceived benefits, again, we find that nonlinearity that we showed earlier. Similarly, when it comes to perceiving the barriers. And so that's a summary of that satisfaction model, which we thought sheds interesting light on this issue. We also looked, so anyway, this is now the total model with the effect of the different variables on the latent dimensions and how those then enter the telework satisfaction model. Okay. We also have looked at, we did a latent transition analysis of consumer expenditures and adaptation across online and in-person channels through the pandemic. And so just looking at expenditures, and we asked them every 2 weeks how they were spending, on groceries, on prepared foods, on other type of goods, as well as various miscellaneous items we were interested in here. And for each one, we're asking on expenditures in person versus pickup versus delivery. So there's a channel choice here that is reflected in these expenditures. And what of course we expected is, compared to pre-COVID, of course, there was a drop of in-person and an increase in pickup and delivery. But for groceries, for example, it really was not that much. For other kinds of goods, it was a more significant one, but ultimately ended up sort of dropping. And what we saw in all of these is quite a bit of inertia ultimately throughout Q1 and Q2 of 2021. So that's what we're calling the new normal. We are living the new normal. And now what we're looking towards is the next normal. We could perform then a latent transition analysis, which is a longitudinal extension to a latent class analysis. And basically we clustered our individuals on the basis of their patterns of spending online versus not online, and summarizing that by looking at pre-COVID, and then in December, and then later looking at sort of the wave 6 results, we found the following. Okay, and so this is pre-COVID, this is the breakdown where class 4 is primarily doing most everything in person, and then these other classes have varying degrees of online reliance on different channels. And what happened after COVID, both looking at it in wave 1 and wave 6, is this very large class that was doing a lot of things in person have now shifted to these other classes, primarily the class 2, where a lot of the other purchases and so on are being done online, whereas the class 1, 2, and 3 pretty much remained doing similar things. They just were augmented by folks who were initially in this class 1. And but when it goes from wave 1 to wave 6, we found very limited changes, with over 86% of our individuals staying in the same class. So there's a strong, again, inertia effect suggesting that people may have kind of settled into a new normal and have kind of moved away from a lot of the initial disruptions that we observed. And so what about this next normal, and where do we go from here? What should our cities, agencies, MPOs be planning for? We've been going through a scenario planning exercise that Susan Shaheen at Berkeley with her PhD student Alex Pan have been leading. And this is still very much work in progress, but through that, there's been a very interesting synthesis of what's happening with remote work. And that really is what we're viewing now as the biggest question. It's what's going to happen to cities versus suburbs, what's going to happen to continued decentralized work, or are we going to centralize again? And so while companies were bullish on remote work for the first few months of the pandemic, and they signaled in summer 2020 that they wanted to maintain a significant office presence, in 2021, a lot of that changed, and there were indications that employers wanted employees to return to the office more quickly than employees seemed to want to return. So just sort of a timeline that Alex Pan has put together. Back in May 2020, there were articles and PR, the New York Times, and so on, with white collar companies race to be last to return to the office, working from home post COVID-19, with Facebook, Microsoft, etc., all embracing remote work. Now, fast forward to August 3rd, 2020. Facebook bets big on the future of New York City and offices with a new lease, but then big tech is moving in Manhattan that was emptied out during the pandemic. And now looking at 2021, Apple employees pushing back against returning to the office, internal letters. As offices open back up, not all tech companies are sold on a remote future. So a lot of uncertainty. And of course, just recently, Google said, well, we're still gonna go back, but maybe a month later. So instead of going back, I guess in early September, now that's being pushed back for another month. The thing is, we don't know what's gonna happen, but what has been the latest indications were that companies were pushing towards more going back to the office, but maintaining some kind of hybrid format. And so employers seem to want employees back in the office for a majority of the time. That would be 3+ days a week. And there seems to be a majority of employers that are advocating for a hybrid model. Now, when we say majority of employees, let's say, or employers, again, remember that we're looking at that 30 to 40% that is teleworkable. That does not apply to all the rest, all the manufacturing, all the services, etc., that are very much depending on physical presence. And in fact, 97% of employers have a plan to bring employees back to the office. More along that, so a recent survey actually had put employees' willingness to accept an average pay cut. Of course, this is stated preferences, right? 5 to 7% for the option to work from home 2 to 3 days a week after the pandemic. And a more recent one in Chicago, reported in Cranes, that number is 5%, not 7%. But what's interesting is a third of respondents said they'd give up the right to vote in all future national elections and local elections so that they could work from home permanently. And that kind of maybe shows you one particular correlation there. All right, so transportation impacts of remote work, of course, will be less frequent commuting. And even if we can go to 2 days a week for many people, for that 30% that is probably telecommutable, that would be a positive impact on our transportation system, except if everybody chooses the same 2 days of the week, then we're gonna create a worse problem on the 3 days where people go to work. So the last thing you want is for everybody to be off Monday and Friday. What you want is to spread that over the days of the week. And if there is one policy intervention that is important, is to convince, is for planning agencies to convince employers to go ahead and and make sure that this is distributed over different days of the week. And so to summarize all of this, we're looking now at what the future will look like. And this is still being elaborated, but we see sort of 4 quadrants here that defined in terms of how rigid or flexible work policies might be, and how centralized or decentralized work locations might be. And so the old normal, the pre-COVID old normal, is one where you had relatively rigid work policies, primarily in centralized work locations. With the pandemic, there was a disrupted transaction. The same sort of rigid work hours were maintained, but a lot of people were working then from home, so that got decentralized significantly. Over time, our current new normal now is one where we still have these, a good fraction of the workforce that decentralized, but some of the rigid work policies have actually been relaxed to recognize why people are still working remotely, such as having to accommodate children who are not going to school, etc. But the question is, where do we go from this new normal? Is the next normal in the next sort of, the next 3 years going to be in this 4th quadrant where we're getting a little more centralized and we are with more flexible policies? Or are we going to move a little closer here to being a little more rigid, but also, perhaps less centralized? Or is it going to be somewhere just in the middle of this, some sweet spot that's going to be a hybrid of all of this? And with that, I leave it to you for your opinion. You can vote on these. If someone can do a poll, that would be interesting. But thank you for your attention, and sorry for exceeding my speaking time. All right.
Thank you, Hani. Yeah, that was wonderful. This is a really new slide deck for Hani, so we're really lucky he took the time over the last few days to pull that together. We've got a couple questions in the chat area, and you may want to take some time during the start of the next session to answer those. So Krishnan Viswanathan, who helped us with BTR number 1 and is at Cambridge Systematics in Tallahassee, has a question about climate resiliency. A lot of us were really hoping to see our carbon footprints go down and stay down with this. So, shift to online shopping, you might want to mention things like that, but really it would be nice to get some new policies in place to make us more efficient, I think, in lots of things, which saves us all time, but we may end up spending it, taking long vacations or something. So, and then Moeed Islam was asking you about that variance or standard deviation on the age variable in your mimic model. So I'll let you maybe get to that in the chat box. Everybody, you're welcome. I think Dr. Mahmassani is going to stay with us. We're moving now into a session on automated and electric vehicles. And Matt, I believe our moderator is here for that next session. Is that right?
Yes, he is, and he's been made co-host privileges just now as well. So if you all could look at the conference program and find whichever Zoom room is most appropriate for your, I guess, viewing wishes, you're welcome to stay on for automated electric vehicles, but that list of Zoom rooms is online on the conference program.
Yeah, and I can actually share that right here. So if you go to the Bridging Transportation Research webpage, it's called bridgingtransport.org. Then right below Hani's in the program tab, you've got the automated electric vehicles, the econometrics and advanced modeling in here. And then you also have policy and safety, as well as public transport, and then a COVID session. And then finally, at 2 o'clock Central Time. So 3 hours from now, I think we're staggering in another session because those speakers are coming from around the world. So as the sun moves, people are waking up and joining that as authors of a book on the handbook of public transport. So Fatima Fakour-Sori will be the technical support there. I'm sorry, the moderators' names are not shown here. Maybe if I go, well, if I shift to conference program, but please go ahead, Nick. I think, yes, you are the moderator. You've got your bike in the background. Bravo. Thank you for handling this next session. And thank you so much, Hani, for being our keynote.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Kara, and thank you, Hani, for a great presentation. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Let me share my screen quickly.